screen.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review, and welcome to Tractate Bava Metzia. We are in a new tractate this week. This class went in hiatus last Thursday because we were celebrating the end of Bava Kama, and we had a siyum that day. I'll be happy to share a link to the recording if you were not able to join us in real time. One sec. Make sure everyone comes in at the door. My name is Rachel Steinerman. This is the My Jewish Learning Daf Yomi Week in Review class, and we are joined for the next half hour by Rabbi Ari Sachs. And I am told that even though you might have thought nothing on today's daf was particularly relevant, this week's set of dafim was particularly relevant, we're going to learn a little bit about Jewish wedding practice today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you, Rachel. I'm looking forward to our conversation or to our learning here today. And feel free to share some ideas in the chat, and we'll be able to hopefully address any of the questions that come up. What I would say is that the topic for today, or not the topic for today, but the fun part for today is that you're going to walk away not just with a little bit more of an understanding of Jewish wedding practice, but actually a fun fact to share if you're ever at a cocktail party. If you want to say, hey, guess what? I learned in Talmud class about this real thing that happens in regular practice. Like, did you know where this comes from? It's a fun fact to share. And as well, I think it helps us understand a little bit more of a key idea that I've shared every time that I've joined you, which is the idea of the orality of the Talmud. That is to say that the Talmud is really an oral document passed down from one generation to the other, from rabbis to other rabbis. And in that process of, that kind of large game of telephone, not just that ideas get lost or get changed, but that it also fits with the way that people remember things and how ideas come up so that it doesn't fit in a specific kind of order. And that actually is how I want to begin our conversation today, because the majority of the text of the dapim, which don't necessarily seem to be so, you could call it relevant to everyday life. Although if you're a lawyer and if you're thinking about how do you determine what kind of belongings or in which cases does one person have a claim to an item, whether it's a cloth, whether it's an oven, as one of the examples are, and the extent to which the claimants are holding up those items and saying it's mine, no, it's at least half of it's mine, and that they make oaths, they swear that certain parts of it are actually mine, and maybe a part of it is I'm not so sure if it's actually mine as well. So I'm sure that over the course of the learning of Bava Metzia, we're going to get much more. You're going to get much more into the nature of those kind of conversations related to ownership. And we're going to deal with one of them today, but again, focusing a little bit more on how the orality of the text relates to the way in which we think as human beings, and also how it helps inspire some of these practices that maybe we don't actually remember where they come from, but then when we see them, we're like, oh my God, that is something that we do. And so with that, we're going to get started. So I am going to, the source sheet should be shared in the chat, but I'm also going to use it share it on the screen. So everyone should be able to see. And Rachel, please tell me if no one is able to see. So we're actually going to begin later on in the sugyot. Later on in the week of dapim. This was the daf specifically for yesterday, I believe. And it starts with a particular braita that's being shared. The braita, which again, a braita is a teaching from the period of the Mishnah, of the Tanaim, but that is not written in the Mishnah. So it's one of these teachings that either was edited out, or my guess is that it just was passed around and people didn't necessarily know it always where it came from, except that teachers pass it along to students and students kind of bring it up. And there are so many more teachings available than just what's written in the text itself. So Rav Tachalifa from the west, i.e. Eretz Yisrael, taught this Braita before Rabbi Abahu. If two people are grasping a garment, this one takes up to where his hand reaches, and that one takes up to where his hand reaches, and they divide the remainder, the part of the garment that is in the grasp of neither, equally. Rabbi Abahu indicated by means of a hand gesture that Rav Tachalifa should add, and this is with the proviso that they take an oath. Okay, we're going to break this down a little bit just to kind of understand more about where it's coming from and also who I wouldn't say the players are per se, but just where they're coming from is important here. So Rav Tachalifa, who comes from the West, Eretz Yisrael. We remember that this is the Babylonian Talmud, not the Jerusalem Talmud, and as such, that anyone who comes from Eretz Yisrael, who comes from the West, as you see in the Hebrew, Bar Merava, Arava meaning the West, that it is someone from a different community sharing a teaching from that community. Or, as often happens, that rabbis in Babylonia would go to Eretz Yisrael and they would learn something and bring that back to Babylonia. But the effect of saying that it comes from the West is that this teaching is not a significant teaching in our community of Babylonia, meaning that for whatever reason, this teaching that comes from the West does not hold halachic weight or does not hold a sense of, has the same level of respect, you could say, than it does if it came from Babylonia. There are an incredible kind of, you could call it insults that are leveled at rabbis who come from the West, being like, oh, what do those people from the West know? They know absolutely nothing about what it is that we're talking about. So there is that little bit of friction between Babylonia in the East and the rabbis who come from the West, from Eretz Yisrael. So why am I talking about this when it comes to this particular teaching? It's because in order to understand what this teaching is doing, we have to see how it relates to the very beginning of the Mishnah in the beginning of Masechet Bava Metzia that begins this week's learning. So if you take a look at the Hebrew, it says, Shnaim adukim betalit. Okay, two people grab a garment or grab a talit. Now, I put here, this is the very beginning of the Mishnah for this week at the very beginning of Bava Metzia. And if you say here, it says, Shnaim ochazin betalit, right? So two people are holding a garment. Now, we could talk a lot about the differences between ochazin here and adukim here. Offhand, there doesn't seem to be so much that is different between those two words. However, it does seem that those two words that the different language between adukim, meaning to grasp, versus ochazin, meaning to hold, has to do with a different purpose of what this holding is doing or what this grasping is actually doing. Meaning, we take a look back at what we said in Bava Metzia 7a, Zenotel an mekom sheyado magaat, that this one grasps until he reaches, V'zenotel an mekom sheyado magaat, and this other person grabs until wherever their hand reaches. That is to say, they're both grasping, they're both holding on to a certain piece of it, as if to say that this is both mine. Or I should say that this garment belongs to me in some capacity by virtue of grasping it. However, if we look back at the beginning of the Mishnah, the way it talks about the holding a garment, Ze omer ani metzatiha, v'ze omer ani metzatiha. Ze omer kula sheli, v'ze omer kula sheli. It's almost as if this holding of a garment is a battle between the two, in which they're fighting over the garment. The section from Bava Metzia 7a, in which it says that two people are grasping the talit, is to say almost as if both of us are holding it together, that both of us are making a claim to it, whereas the language of ochazin, of each one really holding on to it, is to say, no, 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 it's mine. Almost as if you can imagine they're like two kids who are pulling at this garment saying, no, one's mine, one's mine, one's mine. Okay. So that may be the difference between these two different texts. And the fact that there seems to be this little difference actually leads to the next section in Bava Metzia 7a to say, the Gemara asks, but then how can you find a case where the halacha in the Mishnah applies? As the Mishnah teaches that they divide the garment between them and does not teach that this one takes up to where his hand reaches and that one does likewise. In other words, what the Gemara is saying here is that the question in our Mishnah, or the question that our Dapim are really asking, is when you have two claimants who are both saying that this garment is mine, how do you divide both of them up between the two individuals? Okay, because there's a battle going on here. And however, the language of the Braita that comes from the West, which does not seem to be focused on the same idea as our Mishnah from Babylonia, rather, the one from the West is saying both of these people are grasping it. And so, in a certain sense, they're sharing the possession of this particular cloth. That idea of sharing that possession as opposed to fighting over the possession seems to be based upon the language of that this one reaches his hand to where it goes up and this one reaches his hand to where it goes up. And by virtue of our Mishnah not saying that our Mishnah is really talking about the fighting between the two. And all that is to say is that this teaching, this part from Bava Metzia 7a, in which the Gemara asks the question, what it's coming to do is to say, oh, those people in the West, they're not talking about our issue. They're not talking about this thing that we're talking about. They're bringing in this other teaching having to do with something else, as if to say that in the Shakla V'Tari, in the back and forth of the conversation within the Arsugiot, that whoever brings up this teaching from the West, from Eretz Yisrael, that the Tanakama, that the editor of the Talmud is saying, that doesn't really matter. That's not our situation here. So they kind of brush it off to the side. The idea of that battle between Babylon and Eretz Yisrael. With that being said, there is a continuation of the Gemara's rebuttal against bringing in the Braita from Eretz Yisrael by talking about what does it really mean to reach, so for people to reach up to a certain point, or what does it mean to actually adukin, to grasp it? And that's where it says, Rav Papa said, the Mishnah is discussing a case where neither of them is grasping the garment itself, but rather they are holding onto the fringes of the garment. Therefore, each one is required to take an oath, and they divide the garment between them. Rav Papa, in other words, is trying to explain a little bit about why our Mishnah is not the same thing as what the Braita is saying. I'm going to kind of move past that. All he's really doing is just kind of formalizing the fact that the Braita is not saying the same thing as the Mishnah. However, the Gemara continues along the lines of seemingly what the Braita is talking about. And that is very interesting because if the Braita from the West, from the Babylon, from the land of Israel, if that idea was just rejected, then you're going to move on to the next question. But instead, the Gemara actually brings a teaching that is seemingly building off of the idea brought by the West, which is by grasping the talit or grasping the cloth, it is actually showing how there is almost like an agreement that's happening by virtue of one raising their hand to a level and the other one raising their hand to a level here. And in addition, and this is where the orality of Talmud kind of really comes into play in such a fascinating way, is that they also use Rav Papa's teaching, which is designed to be able to rebut what Eretz Yisrael had brought. and uses it a little bit to actually fine tune what does it mean from the perspective of Eretz Yisrael to actually grasp this particular cloth. And so that's where we get to Rav Misharshiel said, learn a halakha with regard to the symbolic transfer of a cloth as a formal act of acquisition from Rav Papa's statement. The entire cloth need not change hands. Rather, once the recipient of the cloth has grasped 3 by 3 finger breadths of the cloth, almost like just a little bit of the cloth, which is the minimum size of a cloth that can be considered a utensil, the transaction takes effect. As we consider such an action to be an implementation of the verse upon which acquisition by means of a cloth is based, now this was the custom in former times in Israel to confirm all things. A man drew off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was the attestation in Israel, which comes from Megillat Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, and we're going to take a look at that very shortly. Now, when I read this, there was like a light bulb that appeared, and I said to myself, hold on a second. Now, as opposed to talking about fighting over a cloth, they're talking about the transfer of a cloth, which seems to fit more with the idea from Eretz Yisrael. And wait a second. As a rabbi, I have done many weddings. And in particular, I have done many weddings in which after you write the ketubah, or after the ketubah has been shared publicly, that in order to show that I, as the rabbi, am now transferring ownership of the ketubah over to the groom, who will eventually transfer it over to his wife, that one of the traditions is you take a cloth napkin and you let the husband actually grab hold of that cloth napkin, and you say, do you now take the ketubah into your possession? They say yes, and then I let go of the napkin and they hold it, and that is the act of actually giving over the ketubah to their hands. So that idea was like coming up in my head, and I was like, wait a second, is that what this particular piece, this idea of cloth as a formal act of acquisition, is talking about? So I did some digging to try to find it, and though I could not find a direct reference to this particular piece in the Gemara, here's what I found that I think is really interesting to think about, and especially that idea of that practical wisdom, the idea, something you could share at a cocktail party. Okay? So this little text comes from an amazing book that many of you, I would highly recommend if you're interested, especially in the halakha. It's called The Observant Life, The Wisdom of Conservative Judaism for Contemporary Jews. It's an update. It's a very thick book, but it's got a lot of updates on how halakha can be practically implemented in one's life in regards to all different aspects, from ritual elements to life cycle elements to interpersonal relationships. It's got a ton of practical wisdom for anyone who is interested in, what does Judaism have to say about this? It's an absolute necessity in everyone's library. So want to just share that. In the section related to weddings, here's what it says. Prior to the wedding, the groom is required to formally accept the terms of the Jewish marriage contract, called the ketubah. This is usually done through the procedure of kinyan sudar, wherein the groom tugs on a cloth handkerchief held by the rabbi performing the wedding to indicate his willingness to accept upon himself the obligations of a Jewish bridegroom as referenced in the ketubah. That's exactly what I was remembering at this moment, thinking, okay, so there's something about a cloth and transferring ownership seemingly coming from this particular daf in Masechet Bava Metzia, and it's called Kinyan Sudar, which led me to another great reference book that anyone who wants to study Talmud, I think is also kind of required to have in your library. It's the Steinsaltz edition, the reference guide. It has so many interesting little nuggets on halakhic concepts, on Talmudic terminology, a great resource to have as you're studying and learning so that you can say, oh, that sounds like an interesting term. I wonder what it really means. I'm going to go to the reference guide and it's going to be able to give me a concise blurb in English about what this idea is. So Kinyan Sudar appears in the Steinsaltz reference guide called Kinyan Agav Sudar, the transfer of ownership by means of a kerchief. It's an extension of the principle chalifin, or barter. When two articles are exchanged for one another, the formal acquisition of one of the articles automatically transfers ownership of the second article as well. Meaning if you have two different things you're going to switch, at least giving over one means that both are considered as being acquired. Since there is no formal requirement for the objects exchanged in this way to be of equal value, the symbolic transfer of a handkerchief or some other small article from one party to another formalizes any agreements made between them. See also kinyan. Okay? Now, though I'm gonna pause here for a quick second, and then I'm gonna bring back the share, because I was always under the impression when it came to this idea of kinyan sudar, of transferring ownership, the reason why we gave a handkerchief, or I sometimes use a pen, is it's got to be something of value, something small, but it doesn't have to be that big. And that the idea of kinyan sudar, or as the rabbi who leads the service for the wedding, a mesader kiddushin, that the term seder there only means order. It's like, this is the person who is in charge of the actual order of how things go, of how things should run in the wedding service, of how to effectively do the act of transferring ownership of the ketubah to the husband, who will then give it to the wife. Didn't think much of it. How wrong I was. And I was wrong because of what I was reading, because of what I read in this particular sugya of ours, on this particular page, when it comes to the actual meaning of sudar. And it blew my mind. Because here's what it says. I'm going to go back up to the actual text from Bava Metzia 7a. And Rav Misharshia said, learn a halakha with regard to the symbolic transfer of a cloth as a formal acquisition from Rav Papa's statement. In the Hebrew, Amar Rav Misharshia Shmamina Hai Sudara. Hai Sudara Kevanda Tafes Be Shalosh Al Shalosh, because it's grasped by three handbreadths of the cloth. Sudara is the same root as sudar, as seder, that I thought was the same as mesader kiddushin or kinyan sudar, meaning order, but it's not. Sudara actually means a cloth. It literally means a cloth. That is to say, this whole time I thought that a mesader kiddushin, the rabbi who was in charge of everything, that it meant that we were just in charge of the order. No. Our job is to make sure that the cloth got to the right person. Like, that's the literal definition of a mesader kiddushin. Or to put another way, that any act of transfer, any act of being able to give something to another person, saying this now belongs to you, which is done in a variety of different little mini rituals, is centered around a cloth because of this sugya, in which we were originally talking about a cloth, a talit actually, that had questionable ownership. But now, because of the way that the Eretz Yisrael brought in the sugya to say, no, it's actually people grasping it, saying both are ours, it actually has the sense of transferring a title from one to the other. And not only that, but that the idea of transferring ownership via this sudar, via this cloth, comes to replace another way of transferring ownership, which you will read a lot about in Masechet Yevamot, having to do with what's known as yibum, in which a person is required to marry a male is required, a brother of a deceased, let me back up. A brother is required to marry their deceased brother's wife if the wife was not did not bear children, and that her children through the brother would end up being the deceased brother's children. And if the brother does not want to do that, they have a process called yibum, in which he says, I will not take this woman on, and she's now free to marry whoever they want. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because there is this idea of bringing up a shoe, and it's called chalitza, in which you spit on someone's shoe, on the brother's shoe, to say, how dare you not allow, like, not uphold your brother's honor and give me a child. I always thought it was like a kind of a weird thing to say, to spit on someone's shoe. But in fact, the shoe has nothing to do with, this person's shoe. It's because before a cloth, a shoe was used to reference what you would give to somebody as a way to transfer ownership of one to the other. And that move from a shoe to a cloth appears in this particular sugya, and it comes by way of this quote from Megillat Ruth. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel to confirm all things. Ruth 4:7, which you're going to see right here. Now, this was formerly done in Israel in cases of redemption or exchange. To validate any transaction, one man would take off his sandal and hand it to the other. Such was the practice in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, acquire for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Because just as a quick reminder of the story of Megillat Ruth, that Boaz acquired Ruth and all of Ruth's husband's former possessions. When the Redeemer, who was the one who was supposed to do it, said, I didn't want to do it, Boaz said, I will take them and they will join me in my family's household. And the way to do that is you take off a sandal and you give it to the person and say that you shall now have ownership over that which was mine, because the sandal used to belong to me. And so there's something really powerful just about knowing that these two things, this foot thing, the sandal thing, and this cloth thing, are both interrelated together. They have this place in our Jewish study and in Jewish practice that may have been just totally like, where did this idea come from? And it comes from this little section in Talmud that isn't even about the main idea of what the beginning of Bava Metzia is all about. Rather, it is here to teach us that because different traditions are being shared one with the other, or to put another way, that different groups of Jews are learning from each other, and they're bringing in different quotes, and they're sharing this, and they're saying, oh, this reminds me of that. You get this beautiful way of understanding how a cloth can mean such an important thing that we still use it today in a ritual, symbolic way to say that when two individuals come together to be united as spouses, that we are using this cloth as a way to say that they are coming together, almost as if they're grasping the cloth as a couple by virtue of sharing that cloth one with the other, recognizing the history of how that cloth was used to transfer ownership. So now, when you go to your next wedding, you can say, and you see that transfer of the cloth, you can say, I know exactly where that came from, Bava Metzia 7a. And that, you know what that cloth actually means? It means sudar, hence misadar kiddushin. The rabbi is not the rabbi who makes the order of the service. The rabbi makes sure that the cloth gets to the right person.
I did not know that. Thank you for teaching that to us today. Rabbi Sachs, we have lots of appreciation in the comments for you. I hope you'll take a minute to read the comments appreciating this class today. Sure. It is a really interesting question. Like, when does the moment of transfer happen? This happened like most dramatically for me in my life this year because we bought a house for the first time. And like the moment, and figuring out what was the exact moment when we were from not owning the house to owning the house. There were no claws involved, but this idea that you need like a physical act that symbolizes the transfer. Yeah, I think we are going to see this again as we move through this tractate for sure.
Absolutely.
So, holding on to something is very interconnected to possession for the rabbis.
Yeah, sure. I would just add one more to that is again, I always thought of it as you want to have something that has like a little bit of value, but not that much. That's why you used a pen or you used a cloth. But I think that the bigger lesson by virtue of seeing it in the sugya is to say, here was a cloth that people used to fight over, right? At the very beginning, that ochazin, they were fighting, saying, this one's mine, this one's mine. But then the teaching from Eretz Yisrael is here to say, no, they're both grasping it. So it's about how the cloth brings people together as opposed to tearing them apart. And I think that's an important understanding of what a transaction is actually supposed to do. You're not supposed to, in like the succession way of thinking about business, that you only succeed if the other person's crying at the end of a business deal, but rather that you want to leave any business deal holding the idea that both are succeeding. And especially in regards to a marriage, right? You don't want one person to feel as if they are being acquired, but rather that they are entering the union together.
I don't have any more to add to that. I think that is a great place for us to end, and we are one past the hour. So thank you, everybody, for all
Thank you
of
so
your
much.
comments. Thank you, Rabbi Sachs, for bringing us this learning today. And we shall go forth. We shall continue through Bava Metzia. We'll see you in this space in 1 week's time. And in the meantime, we'll be in your inbox every morning at 5 a.m. Eastern with more insights. Lovely to see you all. Have a good rest of your Thursday and an early Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.